Bethany. So I'm just going to introduce you. This is Bethany Penman. She is one of our new recruits for the voluntary leader role at the Young Professionals Group. So yeah, let's have a huge welcome for her as she's going to present to us today.
Thank you, Tracy.
No problem.
Could I just ask that everybody puts their microphones on mute just before we start? It's quite hard to hear myself and to hear Tracy, so that's great. Thank you so much. So yes, thank you very much, Tracy, for introducing. My name is Bethany Penman. I am one of the YPG member leads. And I'll be talking about the research that I did for my master's in construction law. So my research was about managing the risk of inflation in construction contracts. Just a few points before we get started. So again, I just ask that everybody keeps their microphones muted. That would be great. The session will be recorded for future viewing on the YPG portal. So if anybody has to jump off, then I believe it will be uploaded there at some point later. I welcome questions and hopefully we'll have some time at the end to address these. So please enter them into the chat. If we run out of time, we will make an effort to answer any remaining questions via email at a later date. Just so that everyone's aware, my presentation isn't legal advice. It's my own research and my own views, and it's based upon the research that I conducted. Okay, let's get started. So first, I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. I am currently a legal advisor in the Commercial Services Department at HLM Architects. I am also an architect, although I don't practice architecture in the same way as I used to. I studied architecture at UCL and have worked for a variety of different practices around London. As I mentioned at the beginning, I did an MSc in construction law dispute resolution at King's. And I'm currently, I've been doing the exams to qualify as a solicitor, and I'm just awaiting those results. So why am I interested in researching about inflation in the construction industry? So back when I started my research, which was around January 2022 to September 2022, there are a lot of things going on in the world. The latest issue that the world was facing, at least the construction industry in the UK economy, was facing hardship because of the Ukraine and Russia war. This compounded difficulties already experienced by the construction industry, such as supply chain reliance and material shortages caused by the Suez Canal blockage and COVID-19 factory shutdowns and their associated site safety measures. So I was interested in researching the ways to mitigate inflation risk caused by mitigate the risk caused by high inflation. And I decided to carry this out by looking at historic periods of inflation, case law, and historic contract forms, and research how inflation has been managed in the past, as well as reviewing current contract forms and other methods that can be employed pre or post contract signing to manage inflation. Before we commence to looking into the case law, I'd briefly like to discuss how supply chain disruption affects inflation, the nature of inflation, and the issues for contractors and employers. So, supply chain disruption. This results in an imbalance between the supply and demand of goods. Manufacture and supply networks are multifaceted and influence economic activity and consumer consumption, production capacity of factories, as well as other socio-economic factors. In the pre-globalization era, supply chains were local. Each community produced most of what it consumed. With the rise in information technology, supply chains became fragmented and global, taking advantage of developing countries' low-cost labor for the manufacture of parts and products. The advantage of separating operations globally brings its challenges. Two risk factors of global supply chains are increasing the number of companies within supply chains, which increases areas for disruption, and this increased number of companies decreases transparency due to the supply chain's increased length, making it difficult to respond to issues. And as you can see at the bottom of that slide, there's a quote from the European Central Bank stating supply chain disruption has a negative impact on global production and trade and a positive impact on inflation. So the nature of inflation. So inflation consists of two principles, and these are cost push and demand pull. Cost push inflation occurs when raw materials and/or labour prices rise, causing the cost of basic goods and services to increase in price. Demand pull inflation occurs when prices rise due to consumers wanting more goods. Production cannot keep up with the increased demand, resulting in higher prices. So cost push inflation is supply driven. Demand pull inflation is, cost push inflation is supply driven, and demand pull inflation is demand driven. High inflation rates are a cause for concern for economies, including reducing purchasing power, increasing cost of products, and raising interest rates. This can unfortunately result in hyperinflation. The Bank of England is responsible for maintaining inflation at the set target by the government. At the current time of my study, that was 2%. Consistently low inflation allows people and businesses the opportunity to plan their future and financial investments. And at the time of my study, which was April 2022, inflation was at 9%, which is obviously significantly higher than the 2% target. So the Bank of England can raise interest rates to help control the rate of inflation and bring it back down to its 2% target. So what does this mean for contractors and employers? So during the years 2020 to 2022, construction material and labour shortages were increasing. They were increasing costs for contractors, and supply chain stresses were making it more difficult to secure materials. Due to rising inflation, large UK contractors developed strategies to mitigate the risk of inflation, including reappraising projects where appropriate. However, these options depend on the terms of the construction contract and are not always applicable. Absorbing increased costs reduces profit margins for contractors, and it affects their liquidity. So depending on the terms of the construction contract, employers or contractors may be more exposed to inflation risk, for example, if they don't have a fluctuation provision. My research analysed standard form building contracts to understand how parties can manage inflation and material shortages. So now I just want to touch upon the academic side of my study, and I promise it will be interesting. Just bear with me. So the hypothesis of my study was essentially the aim of a hypothesis is that you're either you're trying to prove your hypothesis or disprove your hypothesis. So not saying that my hypothesis is true yet, because that will get to the end of my presentation. But my hypothesis was that current provisions in principal standard forms of construction contracts used in the UK do not sufficiently manage and mitigate the risk of rising construction costs. So in order to answer this question, my study had the following aims. The first aim being to identify previous periods of inflation in the construction industry. The purpose of this was to permit analysis of the approaches taken to inflation in construction contracts during these periods. The second aim was to ascertain whether disputes arose regarding inflation during the historic periods defined above. The objective of this was to establish market conditions at the point of signing the contract and during its duration. The third aim was to investigate current circumstances from 2020 to July 2022 and review the causes and effects of inflation. The objective here was to understand whether and why inflation is an issue for the construction industry. The fourth aim was to investigate 4 current standard form building contracts, and I have to caveat that they were current at the time. Obviously now JCT has released their 2024 version, so I believe there are some similarities, but we'll come to those. So to analyse their provisions and to understand if they offer sufficient management for inflation risk. And the final aim was to ascertain what methods other than contractual clauses were available to the parties and to review other possibilities to spread and allocate the risk of inflation. Sorry, this way. So I used a combination of indices to analyse the construction industry at the time across a period of across the various length of time periods, as we'll see in a minute. I used the General Building Cost Index and the UK's Retail Price Index. So the reason the General Building Cost Index was selected is because it's a resource cost index which represents underlying movement in the cost of labour and materials. The UK's Office of National Statistics produces two main indices, so the Consumer Price Index and the Retail Price Index. The Consumer Price Index measures the change in prices of household goods and services, but not including household costs. Retail Price Index measures a similar range of goods and services, but includes house price and interest rate variables. Therefore, for my analysis, I used Retail Price Index, and actually this was used to set the inflation target for the Bank of England until 2003. In addition to that, a Retail Price Index data commenced in 1947, allowing me to study a greater number of years. So this graph shows from January 1968 to January 2022, the Retail Price Index plotted in blue, as you can see on the graph, the Retail Price Index, and in red, you can see the General Building Cost Index, which obviously started a bit later. They started tracking the data a bit later. So there's a gap right at the beginning. Due to high inflation throughout the 1970s, I did want to include this early period of the Retail Price Index, and I did include that period in my study. So this graph is very similar to the previous one. However, it highlights periods of high inflation, i.e. greater than 5%. These time periods highlighted in blue are 1970 to 1978. This is the period before and after the first oil crisis. 1979 to 1982, the second oil crisis. 1987 to 1991, rapid economic growth. 2002 to 2008, which is economic growth prior to the 2008 financial crash, which you can see at the bottom there. And then 2021 to the present when I completed my dissertation, which this graph completes in January 2022. So I just want to explain a little bit about each of these periods so you understand the context of how the world events affected the UK construction industry. So the first oil crisis, this was triggered by embargoes from Arab oil producers in response to Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. This led to a fourfold increase in oil prices by 1974, causing a global economic recession. The second oil crisis, this was as a result of the Iranian Revolution, which disrupted worldwide oil supply. Social unrest in Iran damaged its oil industry, reducing oil output, causing price increases. In the UK, prices increased and it brought a winter of discontent in 1978, which saw private and public sector trade unions demand pay increases. Interest rates increased and peaked at 17% in 1979. And then we've got a period of rapid economic growth. So this was economic growth caused by low interest rates and tax cuts. And inflation rose to a high of 19.9% in 1990. And by 1991, the UK entered recession following government measures to control inflation. And then we've got the period, the growth prior to the financial crisis. So in the early 2000s, the strength of the pound against foreign currency resulted in UK consumers purchasing more foreign goods. So low-cost imports kept inflation low. The cost of borrowing was low, so the property market experienced a boom. Through interest rate reductions between 2005 and 2007, the Bank of England kept inflation under control. However, by 2008, the construction industry was bordering on recession. Material and labour prices increased, and due to economic turndown, projects were put on hold. And this period terminates with the 2008 financial crash. And then finally, the COVID-19 pandemic recovery. So the COVID-19 pandemic saw a decline in construction operations due to supply chain disruption and restrictions on working environments. The industry suffered the impact of material shortages. However, construction operations increased as confidence was renewed towards the end of the pandemic in 2021. So, taking those previous periods that I mentioned on the previous slide, I then researched into law reports and looked at cases that involve cost disputes regarding materials and labour in those time periods. And of course, disputes take some time to get to the courts. So I added about 5 years onto the end of each of those time periods just to have a bit of a wider scope to be researching cases within. So my analysis of reported cases identified 12. Most occurred within the 1973 to 1984 year range, which was covering the first and second oil crisis. Overall, due to the limited number of cases, I didn't find a pattern that correlated to historic inflation events. I do have a theory as to why I didn't find much after, say, about the 1990s. Well, let's just say 1998, because of the introduction of the Housing Grants and Construction Regeneration Act and statutory adjudication. Again, I don't have any proof that that's the case because of just the limited amount of cases that I had, but I think that might be an underlying reason why there weren't so many cases later on. So I analysed those cases, those 12 cases on the previous slide, and came across 4 common themes across those cases. Those were delay causing an increase to the cost of labour and/or materials. So this is where another party's actions resulted in the prolongation of the contract period or late delivery of materials resulting in price increases. Then we've got the second theme, which was calculation of the price adjustment mechanism. This was where fluctuation mechanisms in the contract were in the contract, but the parties disputed how it was to be applied. The third theme is interpretation of price adjustment clauses. So again, this is where the parties had a fluctuation provision, but they disputed the meaning of standard form and bespoke fluctuation provisions. And the fourth theme that I found being that parties had supplementary agreements to account for inflation. And this is where parties made post-contract agreements because of inflationary pressures. So as a bit of background about each of those, I will cover the themes of number 1, 2, and 4, just in the interest of time. So delay causing an increase in the cost of labour and/or materials. So this is the case of Crudace Construction Limited and Cowards Concrete Products. So Crudace was the contractor, and they engaged Cowards, the subcontractor, to supply and deliver masonry blocks for the construction of a school. According to the contract, if Crudace were unsatisfied with the materials supplied, they were required to notify Cowards within 24 hours of delivery. In addition, the clause stated, as is noted on the slide, that Cowards are not liable for any consequential loss or damage caused or arising by reason of late supply or any fault, failure, or defect in any materials or goods supplied by us. Crudace sought to recover costs for loss of productivity and delays to the main works. The damages included an element due to inflation. Delays incurred arise in costs as a result. At first instance, the court considered the term consequential loss or damage and held that this did not include any loss which directly and naturally resulted in the ordinary course of events from late delivery. The Court of Appeal agreed and dismissed the appeal. Crudace were unsuccessful in their claim for damages. This case illustrates a narrow interpretation of the word consequential. Delay to the works is an expected result of materials not being delivered on time. Consequently, delay to the works on site for lack of material is in the contemplation of Crudace in their role as main contractors. So this was the second theme, calculation of the price adjustment mechanism. And this is the case of Rees and Kirby Limited and Swansea City Council. So this case concerned interest on a cost-adjusted amount due to inflation. Rees were contractors engaged under a fixed price contract by Swansea to construct a housing estate. The works commenced in 1972 and were due to be completed in July 1973. However, they reached practical completion a year later. Rees claimed variations and late instructions caused them delay and requested an extension of time and loss in expense. The years 1972 to 1973 saw a sudden increase in the rate of inflation, and the UK government permitted local authorities to make ex gratia, which is voluntary payments, to contractors to reflect losses on fixed price contracts. The council didn't make the ex gratia payment, and by 1976, Rees wrote to Swansea regarding its contractual claim. In 1977, Rees requested either conversion of the contract to a fluctuating price or resolution of their contractual claim and interest. In 1979, the architect certified the amount claimed by Rees without interest. Rees reserved their right to interest. The Court of Appeal held that Rees were entitled to interest from February 1977 to August 1979, so when they renewed their contractual claim, but not from practical completion to February 1977. Financing charges were not recoverable under the clauses of the contract and were only granted from when the claim was pursued anew. This case demonstrates that interest is payable in situations where a party is not actively engaging in an alternative method of compensation for their claim, i.e. from when Rees discontinued its pursuit of the ex gratia payment. So just a final case, and this is on the theme of parties' supplementary agreements to account for inflation. And this is the case of Waits Limited and Greater London Council. So Waits were contracted to construct 1,807 residential units at Hendon Aerodrome by the GLC in 1970. The contract contained clauses for adjustment of the contractor's sum after the tender date, should there be fluctuations in the cost of labour or materials. In 1972, disputes developed between the parties regarding the amount payable to Waits. The GLC recognised existing fluctuation mechanisms in the contract were not adequately compensating Waits because of the level of inflation at the time. So the Waits and GLC formed a supplemental agreement. And this agreement set out a method of adjustment to the contract by reference to the Ministry of Housing and Local Government's housing cost yardstick. And they also included an alternative method should this method, the housing cost yardstick, no longer be available. The Ministry of Housing failed to revise the housing cost yardstick, and this caused financial loss to Waits. The parties attempted to negotiate the alternative fluctuation adjustment, but were not successful. Based on Waits' interpretation of the supplemental agreement, they requested increased costs. The GLC refused to pay these increased costs, so Waits left the site. Waits alleged that the GLC had repudiated the contract and the supplemental agreement, and the GLC alleged that Waits had repudiated the contract by leaving the site. The dispute was referred to arbitration, and the arbitrator expanded on the rate of inflation at the time, stating, "Neither party contemplated that the rate of inflation would increase to the extent that it did between October 1972 and February 1974, nor would any reasonably prudent contractor or employer in 1972, in the like circumstances to the parties, have contemplated such an increase." The arbitrator noted that the Ministry of Housing were no longer updating the yardstick from 1973. And in addition, the arbitrator found that the GLC's failure to pay Waits did deprive Waits of a substantial part of the benefit to which Waits were entitled under the contract and supplemental agreement. And at first instance, the judge disagreed with the arbitrator, finding that in following the supplemental agreement, the GLC had not repudiated the contract or the agreement. Waits' request for additional payment had been unjustified, and they had, by leaving the site, repudiated the contract and the supplemental agreement. The Court of Appeal agreed with this conclusion and dismissed Waits' appeal. So hopefully some interesting cases there that demonstrate that parties have used quite a different number of options across the years, across other periods of high inflation, to manage those risks. So now we come on to analysis of more recent forms of contract, starting with the JCT. So in my analysis, obviously I conducted this back in 2022, and this was before any knowledge probably of JCT 2024 came out. So I am going to just focus on the 2016 versions, so the standard building contract and the design and build contract. But from what I understand from my research and reading around the 2024 versions, I do not believe provisions have changed that much, but I would say definitely take advice and review the clauses. So I will start with the JCT standard building contract with quantities. This is a lump sum contract, and it's used where the project is to be procured using a traditional procurement route. Clauses 4.3 and 4.14 provide three fluctuation options to account for inflation. That's option A, B, or C, and I'll come to those options in a minute. The contract also allows for no fluctuation provision to be selected or for an alternative mechanism to be entered. And unless otherwise stated, option A applies. The JCT Design and Build 2016, this has substantially the same options as the standard building contract with just minor differences in wording. So on to the fluctuation options themselves. So option A allows for price adjustment due to changes in statutory contributions, levies, or taxes that the contractor is required to pay. The full terms of option A are set out in Schedule 7 of the contract. I believe in the 2024 version, there is not a Schedule 7, but they are available on the JCT website. I may have that wrong, so don't quote me on that. But I would recommend, if you have any questions about the fluctuation options and where they can be found, there is an email address at the end, and you can contact JCT if you cannot find them. So back to option A. This is the default option if no provision is entered into the contract, meaning that this is the 2016 contract. Again, like I say, please check the 2024. So this means that if it's the default option, that the risk of inflation remains with the contractor. Option A wouldn't be adequate to protect against the risk of inflation in materials or labour costs. So option B. Option B provides for changes in labour and material costs and fluctuation in tax and statutory duties. This option would be adequate to protect against the risk of inflation, as the contractor's actual costs would be assessed against the base date costs. An accurate account of how inflation has affected the project can be built up. And finally, fluctuation option C. Option C allows for formula adjustment using the JCT formula rules. The rules divide aspects of the contract into groups for which there is a corresponding index. When a payment is calculated, the value of each group is adjusted using the latest index for that segment of the project. Thus, each valuation is altered by a combination of indices. So are these two contracts adequate to protect against the risk of inflation? Removing fluctuation provisions was common in the construction industry due to relatively low inflation historically experienced since the early 1990s. While the JCT Standard Building Contract and Design and Build Contract 2016 do provide fluctuation provisions, the default option A is not suitable when inflationary pressures are high. In the current climate, this provision would not be adequate. Well, the current climate being 2022, this provision would not be adequate to protect the parties from the risk of inflation. Recovery of increased costs would only be possible through the use of alternative contract clauses, leaving limited scope for contractors to recoup costs. However, options B and C do provide more appropriate mechanisms for protecting against the risk of inflation. These options allow the parties to agree a more appropriate risk profile, spreading the risk. So now on to NEC. Excuse me. NEC consists of several pricing options which depend on the pricing structure and risk profile of the parties, the majority of which have to be used with option X1, price adjustment for inflation. So those of you who are experienced with NEC4 will see, obviously, the titles themselves do help to describe where the risk is allocated, but we will just run through them briefly. So the lump sum contracts, so option A, this is a price contract with activity schedule. The activity schedule can be altered after the contract date due to compensation events and inflation, but as I mentioned, only if option X1 is selected can inflation be compensated for. Similar is the case in option B, the price contract with bills of quantities. The bill of quantities can be adjusted after the contract date due to compensation events and inflation, again, only if X1 is selected. So the two target cost contracts, so option C, target cost contract with bill of quantities. This contract sets a target cost, but not an overall cap, as the contractor can have its contract sum adjusted for compensation events and inflation, like I said, with option X1 selected. And likewise, option D, this is the target cost contract with bills of quantities. This has the function of remeasurement as the project progresses, but with a total of the prices setting a target cost. This will change throughout the works, reflecting the actual work completed, as well as compensation events and inflation. Again, only if X1 is selected. So X1 is quite a commonality across the first four. Option C and D, the risk of inflation without option X1 is shared depending on the pay and gain mechanism between the parties. And the option A and B, the risk of inflation in those contracts without X1 selected is with the contractor. So on to the cost reimbursable option. This is option E. The contractor is reimbursed for the actual cost incurred in carrying out the works with no cap limit or pay and gain share subject to disallowed costs. So prices are altered to consider compensation events, but not inflation. This is due to the contractor being able to claim for all its defined costs, so the risk of inflation is with the employer. And finally, option F, the management contract. The contractor is reimbursed for defined costs, including work done by itself and its subcontractors, plus a fee. So again, the risk of inflation lies with the employer. So does NEC4 adequately protect against the risk of inflation? In NEC4, the parties must select option X1 to have the protection against inflation risk under options A, B, C, and D. In an inflationary climate, employers and contractors under option C and D, well, employers under option C and D and contractors under option A and B are exposed without option X1 selected. While contractors can claim due to delays and changes in materials, there is limited scope. NEC option X1 price adjustment mechanism is based on indices, so it's fundamental that the correct indices are selected for appropriate elements of the work. Okay, so now I would like to look at PPC 2000. This is the final contract that I looked at in my study. So PPC 2000 is a multi-party contract integrating the entire design team and construction team under one agreement. This partnering team of people includes the client, they call it constructor, all consultants, and some or all specialists. PPC 2000 creates a contractual link between all partnering members such that they can rely on each other's assertions and contributions. Under clause 20.11, PPC 2000 permits fluctuation in the price framework and consultant terms only if a fluctuation provision is stated in these documents. Therefore, without any express clause, the risk of material or labour price increase due to inflation is shared by the contractor and the employer. However, there are other provisions within PPC 2000 that may assist with managing inflation that I'd just like to mention. The constructor is responsible for managing all risks associated with the project and the site, unless specified otherwise. However, if a delay by the client results in an increase in the cost of labour and/or materials, the constructor would have grounds for a claim for additional expenditure and extension to the date for completion. So let's touch upon design and risk management. So PPC 2000 allows for the creation of the partnering team. So as soon as feasible during the pre-construction phase, this can be done. The constructor working in collaboration with the design team members allows a sharing of construction knowledge to inform the design. So early contractor involvement, ECI, and early supply chain involvement, ESI, are essential to the management of risk. The core group and early warning are another way that PPC 2000 manages inflation risk. So the core group are responsible for resolving issues and disputes. Should high inflation mean that an element of the work is likely to increase in price or delays are expected to the project, the core group can meet to discuss risk mitigation. The core group must unanimously reach agreement as to the resolution of issues. All partnering team members have an obligation to notify others as soon as they are aware of any matter adversely affecting or threatening the project. This is the early warning element. Thus, increases in labour and/or material costs are raised as soon as they become apparent, allowing early mitigation of price risks. As a result of open book pricing, which is another element of PPC 2000, open book pricing, inflation risk can be managed. pricing process is transparent, and such strategies to mitigate price risk may be to define price volatile elements of the project sooner so that the constructor can purchase them, thereby converting an undefined cost to a fixed price. And finally, shared pain gain incentive. The shared pain gain incentive in PPC 2000 encourages all partnering team members to reduce cost. In situations of material price inflation, this may include suggesting cost-effective alternatives with savings benefiting all parties. So, is PPC 2000 adequate to protect against the risk of inflation? The provisions above demonstrate the range of clauses where risk is mitigated. Whether a fluctuation provision is included in the contract or not, it's in all parties' interest to warn of risk situations early and to work together to minimise cost implications. Overall, PPC 2000 appears to adequately protect against the risk of inflation with or without fluctuation clauses. So finally, just to end my presentation, we'll end it shortly, I just want to summarise different options within the different contracts as they offer a variety of protections against inflation depending on the procurement route and whether you are the contractor or employer. So, JCT Standard Building Contract and the Design and Build Contract offer limited scope for the management of inflation risk with option A. But with options B and C, they offer the greatest protection for the contractor against the risk of inflation. Other contractual clauses and additional JCT agreements may assist with the management of inflation. NEC4, the protection of inflation depends upon the pricing mechanism chosen. Without option X1 in options A, B, C, and D, the risk of inflation remains either with the contractor or with the employer. And under options E and F, as mentioned previously, there's a sharing mechanism involved in those. Well, the contractor will recoup their costs just by the nature of those types of contracts. In PPC 2000, this encompasses many methods to manage labour and/or material cost inflation without fluctuation provisions. Its collaborative approach, combining early contractor involvement, early supply chain involvement, early warning and open book pricing, results in risks being removed or managed before they occur. So then just to wrap up, the sort of culmination of my research was to identify alternative methods to manage the risk of inflation. So this takes hints from the case law and also from the contracts that we've reviewed. So fluctuation or price adjustment clauses are one method to manage the risk of inflation. However, reported case law and standard building contract forms display other methods that can be used by the parties to deal with inflation risk. So the first one I'll touch upon is pre-contract stage. So early collaborative construction contracts. So these contracts ensure that contractors and employers are bound to work together, and this may assist in managing inflationary pressures. As seen in the analysis of PPC 2000, collaborative construction contracts allow for early joint risk management and agreement of actions to mitigate risks. These might include accurate approximate costing, agreement of further steps to define the cost implications, and apportioning risk to those most able to manage and afford the risk. Collaborative contracts allow project team members to share the benefit of cost savings through pain gain mechanisms. And overall, they provide a holistic view of risk management, making it all team members' responsibility. And while we mentioned PPC 2000, the JCT's pre-contract services agreement is another type of contract that you may be able to have a similar sort of early involvement in the project. So we'll just move on to actually talking in a bit more detail about early contractor involvement and early supply chain involvement. These allow identification of high value or inflation volatile elements and can focus the design team and construction team's efforts in ensuring an item is procured at the best possible price. So as I said, PPC 2000 is an example of this, but also the JCT pre-construction services agreement. So a contractor can contribute their expertise to the project and be compensated for their involvement if the project doesn't reach construction. So pre and post contract, so early procurement and payment schedules are an example of this. Organising payment schedules and procuring in advance such that unpredictable costs can be fixed as soon as possible removes an element of inflationary pressure. In inflationary times, it's particularly important to complete a project as soon as possible because of the adverse relationship between time and money. While labour cost in installation or construction is still present, a portion of an item's cost can be fixed. So then the post-contract stages, there's two alternative methods to manage the risk of inflation: negotiation and termination. Obviously, termination shouldn't be considered lightly. We'll touch upon that in a moment. Firstly, starting with negotiation. Negotiation post-contract is common during periods of inflation, as we can see from the case law examples. Forcing risk onto the contractor that can't bear the weight will result in their collapse. An employer may consider the financial strain on the contractor and offer some sort of arrangement by way of a supplementary agreement. And then termination post-contract. This will release all parties from continued performance of their primary obligations. However, it's not generally available to parties wishing to terminate due to inflation. There is no common law right to terminate for convenience unless expressly stated. Contractual termination clauses covering default and insolvency of either party may constitute grounds for termination, as well if work is suspended due to specific causes. Under NEC 4, the employer can terminate for reasons of force majeure, but the contractor cannot. Under the JCT Standard Building Contract 2016 and the Design and Build Contract 2016, either party can terminate if the works are suspended due to force majeure, civil commotion, or exercise of a statutory duty. It may be challenging for a contractor to prove these situations have occurred. And finally, I think a really important point to make is that termination by the employer may not resolve the effects of or remove the effects of inflation on the project. It's likely that if the contractor cannot source or materials or labour to carry out the work, another contractor would not be able to either. Thus, it may not be wise to terminate the contractor and engage another. So a key takeaway from this presentation is that post-contract, there are limited methods by which one can manage the effects of inflation. Pre-contract offers many more solutions and potential to protect oneself from risk. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you, Bethany. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to start in a discussion or unmute yourself and fire away.
You're welcome to put any questions in the chat as well. I'll monitor that just in case anybody has any.
We have a few people saying thank you.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, spending your lunch break with us.
It's great. So just to reiterate, this has been recorded, this session. It'll be edited and we'll post it onto the YPG portal. And with that, I'd just like to say a huge thank you on behalf of JCT YPG and all its members. Thank you, Bethany, for your time. It's been great and very informative.